Hey, how you doing? Thank you. Thank you for coming to the first panel. Awesome. I'm glad you had a great night last night. Crawled here. Yeah, that's good. That's good. And, well, you are in the right place if you came for prosthetics. All right? And just a couple announcements before we get started. Of course, we do ask that you wear the mask over the whole mug here. If you need to eat or, drink, just do the little, that kind of thing. But keep it on for the safety of everyone. Keep it on for the safety of everyone here, the guests, stuff like that. We also, this year's charity for Dragon Con is Open Hands. It's for food insecure seniors, that kind of thing, delivering meals, that sort of thing. It's local. It's great. I've done it before. Lots of Dragon Con people come out and do that throughout the year, but they're a really worthy cause. And so, just throw some money in here. That would be awesome. And also, over there, we've got cards. We're still doing that, right? Yeah, good. Where if you want them to answer some calculations, some crazy calculations, like how many, T-Rexes you can fit in a truck or some kind of weird thing, fill this out, put it in. And they're going to do that tomorrow. What time? In the morning? Sure, first one?
Don't know that one.
You got it. All right. So that sort of a kickoff kind of thing. Come on in, yeah. And the only other thing is have fun, enjoy. We're going to have questions afterwards. I'll be running the microphone to you. And when we're done, we're just going to exit out here. And that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the panel. All right.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Prosthetics panel. Can everyone hear me okay? It's not? Okay.
Let me crank that up for you. Okay, go ahead.
How about now? Great. Okay, well, I am Celia Yost. I went to art school and knew nothing about prosthetics, so I am moderating this panel. And I will let our lovely panelists introduce themselves.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? No?
Not very well.
Good morning. Better? My name's Ken B. Bell. It's actually my author name, but in my day job, I have been fitting prosthetic limbs for the last 25 years. I'm a specialist in upper limb prosthetics. I fit just about every level of amputation, and it's been a passion of mine since when I was a teenager and I saw Blade Runner and Star Wars and those types of things, and it really just put me on a really deep rut that I've been riding pretty well for the last, like I said, 25 years. And recently I've become a self-published author, and that's what drew me to Dragon Con, and then I saw that at a science track, and I volunteered for this. So it's been a great experience being here.
Cool. I'm Topher Hunter. I have a PhD in bioengineering. Spent about a decade working for one of the largest endoprosthesis manufacturers, so hips, knees, shoulders, elbows, that kind of thing. But those are all the prostheses that go inside the body. So probably more relevant to today's conversation is I've also spent a lot of time in the nitty-gritty part of clinical studies and regulatory affairs. How the heck do you get the government to say, yes, I can sell this thing to somebody?
Hi, I'm Rob Hampson. I have a PhD in physiology and pharmacology, practicing in neuroscience and neurology. And I have been involved for more than 20 years with the DARPA programs that have developed a number of the advanced prosthetics, which are sadly underutilized. Wonderful things that have been developed and are generally not in common use, and that's part of what I'm hoping we can talk about today. But I'm also an author, and I have a book coming out. I was inspired by the $6 Million Man. I'm that old, yes, and went to study bionics, and the field was not there. But thanks to the inspiration, I have written my own version of the $6 Million Man, which will be coming out from Bain in March of next year.
Great. Well, why don't we talk a little bit more about the current state of technology? How close are we to our exciting cyborg future?
You want to start with that?
Oh boy, do I want to start with you. Okay, so number one, if you talk to stakeholders, if you talk to stakeholders, what do they want to be able to do with a bionic limb, with prosthetic limb? Is they want to be able to restore independent function. Feed myself, be able to lift a fork, a spoon, cut food with a knife, brush my hair, brush my teeth, a number of things like that. And they can be done with purely passive and purely external prosthetics, but wouldn't it work so much better if we could control them with the brain? Biggest issue is that sometimes means you have to stick electrodes in the brain. And if you've ever seen the videos from DARPA, from Pitt and Carnegie Mellon of the brain control robotic arms, those are very large electrode pedestals sitting on the patient's head that everything is connected to. There is a prosthetic that is controlled by picking up impulses from nerves in the upper arm, which presupposes that there's an upper arm left to pick the impulses up from. There are devices out there, and they're not being used because so many times they can't be paid for, and they can't be maintained. As far as state of the art, for lower limb prosthetics, springs and hinges are wonderful. And for upper arm prosthetics, there are devices that can be neurally controlled and give a lot of function. There's a few devices that are iPhone controlled. There's a hand that can be iPhone controlled. I see you nodding, and I'm wondering if you mind if we ask you questions later. Okay, that would be wonderful. Thanks. And so that's a large chunk of the state of the art, but it is a far cry from our vaunted cyborg future.
So something I was actually almost more of a question for you and for both of you. I was recently reading about some of these like EMG transcutaneous, so that it doesn't poke through the skin and read the nerves. It's reading surface electrical currents from the nerves. But like some of these upper limb prostheses, my understanding is they'll have maybe a dozen motions programmed into the motor controllers, and you've got to pick one of those dozen. So if you haven't picked the right, if it's just not loaded in there, or if it's not an option from the manufacturer, that motion is not available to you. Can you expand on that?
Are you thinking or asking about like particular grip patterns for a hand?
Yeah.
So most systems that are electronically controlled these days will use surface electrodes, and most systems will use usually 2 electrodes inside the socket, and they'll read basically a forward and a backward signal. So if you have an amputation of the upper arm, then you're looking at a signal on your biceps and your triceps. And what you'll need to do is, if you have a hand that gives you the option of more than one type of grip pattern, you need to then develop a way of selecting which grip pattern you want to use. That's sometimes done with an outside source like an iPhone. It can be done by cycling through like a menu of options. That can be done in a bunch of different ways. Add a button to the outside of the prosthesis. Teach the person to fire both muscles at once to switch through the systems. Or in a very advanced case, what you can do is you can add a system that's a system of electrodes known as pattern recognition, where instead of using 2 electrodes, we'll use a suite of about 8 or 10 electrodes. And then we can listen to all the muscles at once. And then in very advanced user cases, you can be taught to fire your muscle in up to 8 to 10 different ways. And then each one of those patterns would then initiate a direct link to a different type of grip pattern. And I know the gentleman out in the audience has one of the hands that will do that. But whether or not it's day-to-day practical or feasible is debatable. I've done it on a couple of patients and had limited success because it is a very complicated way to run your prosthesis. And most of my patients who've tried it found it to be a little bit too much of a learning curve.
Now, this is distinctly different from the one that DARPA really pitched. Johnny Matheny lost his arm to cancer, and he has osteointegration, which is he's got a titanium post that is attached to the bone of the upper arm, magnetic bearing at the elbow, and then a fully articulated hand and wrist. He has had a surgeon has gone in and taken the nerves that would have controlled the radius and the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the like. Those nerves have been relocated from where they're normally fairly deep in the arm and brought up to just under the skin. And then he wears a suite of sensors around the upper arm. Johnny can play piano. He taught himself to play piano. And so he has a fully articulated arm. More than that, if he's using the wireless version of the sensors, he can disconnect the arm at the elbow, and he can shake your hand. He can grip your hand with his detached arm. He cannot do thing. He can't walk it along the table. It's not strong enough. It's not strong enough. But he has an hour at most before he has to recharge.
It only lasts an hour?
Yeah, he has about an hour battery in it because it's entirely battery. If he goes and recharges it, the wireless sensors also have to recharge, and so he will, generally speaking, if he goes to a show, goes to a conference or a meeting, and he'll come out and he's wearing the wireless sensors and controlling his arm, and then he'll go to lunch or whatever. When he comes back, he's wearing the wired suite of sensors. But he has very limited time frame. And by the way, when the program ended, they took the arm away. It took quite literally an act of Congress to get him his arm back, because they had to find a way to fund the maintenance, which is in fact one. I mean, we can get to that later, but that's one of the reasons why we see such a low implementation of this technology. It's there, but we can't get it out.
Yeah, I'm really curious too. Like, how much would something like that weigh, and like how much would it cost? Because that seems like those would be limiting factors too.
It's very difficult to assess the cost of Johnny's arm because it was part of a $150 million research program. So
I heard the figure that that his arm would be somewhere in the realm of $250,000
Right.
if it was retail.
yeah, that sounds right. That
Yeah.
sounds right. The Luke arm itself is what, 100 to 150?
Yes, yeah, depending on how much of it you get. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. As far as the weight, I think the commercial version of the Luke arm, which is what Johnny is wearing, is, I want to say it's about 8 to 10 pounds if you wear the whole thing, because you can get it in a couple different versions, either from the shoulder down to the elbow. So if you get it all the way down at the below elbow version, I think it's only about 3 or 4 pounds. More. Actually, at almost every level of amputation, the prosthesis almost always weighs less because there's no water in it.
Yeah, and we will do questions at the end, so someone can bring a mic around so everyone can hear you. When you
Yeah, the
ask.
question was how much does the amputated limb weigh compared to the prosthesis?
Topher, you mentioned regulations earlier. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Way to bring the room down. So in brief, in every market in the world, there is a regulatory body which they're tasked with the role of making sure that their public is receiving safe and effective medical products. In the United States, the Food and Drug Administration is tasked with ensuring that anything that and there's a very specific list and I can never quite get it right, but anything that treats, mitigates, prevents, cures a human disease or fundamentally alters the human body structure or function falls under the purview of the FDA. So all of these implants are regulated by the FDA, And again, their job is a very important one, to make sure that we're not selling garbage out there that could hurt somebody. So it tends to be a very long and complex path for some products, especially basically the more novel it is, the weirder and harder it gets. If you can say, look, this arm is exactly like this old arm, then there's a pretty straightforward, clear-cut path. If it's something that's going to be poking through my skin and reading my nerves and making interpretive decisions and maybe crushing somebody's hand when I shake their hand, there's a lot more risk in that, and so the FDA is going to put a lot bigger burden on what kind of proof do you have that this is safe and effective. Fun aspect of it is actually the software upgrades, right? How many times do you upgrade the software on your phone and you think nothing about it? Well, if the software on your arm fundamentally changes the behavior of your arm, changes its risk and safety profile, that's a new FDA submission. So you got to do more paperwork, send it into the FDA. Medical devices get updates. If they get them at all, they'll probably get them every couple of years, because it's just such a pain in the tuchus to go through that process. You're basically going to bundle it all together and take your time.
About how? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So there's a new story making the rounds about that, because we talk about prosthetics and we think in terms of artificial arms, legs, and the like. But prosthetics also includes medical implants, such as the Argus 2 retinal implant, which restored a measure of sight. It's not a whole lot if you're talking about a 10 by 10 pixel grid of vision. You can read one letter at a time, but you can read. You can find a door on the other. You can find a step as long as it's distinctly marked. The Argus 2 has been discontinued. The company's been bought. They're not making it anymore. They're not doing the software upgrades. There are people whose implants are failing, and they're in the middle of a daily activity. They're in the dark. And it has happened, and there are reports of this. And it's one of those things. Again, it comes down to the regulatory. You don't just, do an update like your phone wants to do every other day. You just don't do that. And if you can't do the updates, you have an inactive device.
About how long does the development of a new prosthetic take? Like, how many years?
I mean, if you're talking about, if you're just modifying an existing design to make it, more comfy or fit better or have a little bit smoother action on the hinge or something, that can be a year, 2 years. If it's fundamentally new, like the Luke arm, that must have been a decades long.
It was 4 years.
What?
Yes, the Luke arm was 4 years.
Now, is this an example of throw money at it and it
That's
happens?
exactly what it is. That's exactly what happened. $100 million program from DARPA. They said in 4 years we want an arm, and in 4 years they got an arm. Now it took them the entire program ran for 12, and that was all refinements. And that was also trying to develop a way to get sensory feedback back from the arm into the brain. And that's essentially where they were when the program ended. And unfortunately, though, throw money at the problem. When that money dries up, the problem's still there.
I'll add here that if we're talking about something that's not quite as big of a leap as the Luke arm, so like when I first got into the industry about 25 years ago, the most advanced thing that we had for a leg prosthesis was the C-Leg. So right when I started, the C-Leg 1 came out, and this is a microprocessor-controlled knee made by a company called Autobach in Europe, and it came out just the same way as Topher mentioned. It's brand new. It was novel. There were no computer-controlled knees when it came out, and so the insurances had basically no idea what to do with this. So if we sent them a bill for a computer-controlled knee, they basically said, yeah, we're not paying for that. It's really expensive, and we have no idea what it is. So fast forward to today, where when I fit a patient with an above-knee amputation and I want to, if I feel that this patient is appropriate for fitting with a microprocessor-controlled knee, I now have a choice of 6 or 7 different microprocessor-controlled knees from different manufacturers, all with different pluses and minuses, and so I now have like, you know, a menu of what I can pick from for this patient. In the arm department, I believe the closest analog would be the what we call multi-articulating hands. So that's a hand that doesn't just do this, but it actually can do this, and it can do this, and it can do this.
Watch your fingers.
Yeah, I know. But you know, the first thing that everybody wants to do with their multi-articulating hand is to program it to give everybody the bird so they can drive with it. There you go, right? That's what we call driving mode. Anyway, the multi-articulating hands, the first one that came out was the iLimb from Touch Bionics. And when that one came out, honestly, compared to what we have today, it was kind of junk. It was mostly plastic. It broke really easily. It was kind of a mess, but it was amazing, right? Because it didn't just do this. So this was also about 20 years ago, and same thing. No one wanted to pay for it. We had patients coming in saying, "I've read about this. I want it. I'll pay out of pocket. I don't care what it costs." And now we're kind of reaching that same sweet spot with the knees. Again, about 20 years later, where I have a lot of different options. Insurances are kind of paying for it more, but there's still a lot of pushback. And that has to do with a lot of other things that I don't really have control over, like us being able to show that the hands are really better than a regular hand that just opens and closes. And maybe later we'll ask this gentleman if he's had experience with both, and if he can say definitively whether or not one is better than the other, because that's part of the problem. We can't tell the insurances, yes, this one is definitely better, because you know we have all these papers to show that it's true.
Is there any particular challenges or things the prosthetic industry still cannot do, like, or anything that people are like still working towards?
I have a list. I think probably the one thing that most of my patients would like is they would like the legs and the arms to be lighter and more comfortable to wear. I think that is basically going towards osseointegration. Once we have a really stable osseointegration. So osseointegration, if you're not familiar with it, is an implant into the bone that then protrudes from the end of the limb and then has a universal clamp on the outside that then you can attach a prosthesis to. So instead of wearing a socket that encompasses the entire limb, the prosthesis is literally just like Lego attached to the end of this implant. I've once this started happening about 10 or 15 years ago, I realized that I was looking at the demise of my profession and my career, because what I do as a clinician is mainly build sockets for patients. Everything else is just things that I put on the socket to make it into a prosthesis. But the part that I really make is the socket. So that part is going to be huge. Once we can attach every limb through a surgical implant, I think a lot of issues will go away, and you'll see prosthetic acceptance go up quite a bit.
Yeah, think about like especially a lower limb amputation and prosthetics. So even if it was just a complete disarticulation of the knee, so the femur, the leg in your thigh is intact, and the femoral head, the femoral condyles, so all your knee joint is just fine and healthy. Let's take this imaginary patient. They got a very clean disarticulation of the knee. Think about the skin and the tissue on the bottom of your foot, and now think about the skin and the tissue that's on your thigh, right? Big difference in thickness and density, in how much subcutaneous fat and other stuff is in there, because your foot has evolved over millions of years to take a beating. Your thigh has not. So these patients, they're bearing, this bone is literally pushing right onto the tissue, and then it goes into this socket. So the idea in this, instead of having to layer up all the awesome cushioning and everything that you need, by the way, right? Nice, sweaty, moist environment, sliding around a little bit. Can we talk chafing? The idea, it's not an after 10 p.m. So all of that is to lead up to the reason. Yeah, I've done some work on these percutaneous abutments, and so if we could stick something in the end of the bone, and then that attaches to the implant, well, now all that force, all my body weight is going from bone to chunk of metal, say, to implant. No more soft tissue getting squishies. So that's the idea. Problem, you've got something that's sticking across the skin. Means our skin is a great barrier against infection. Now you've got potentially an open sore, basically. So lots of problems to solve.
Yeah. If you look at someone like Johnny Matheny, who is the example I tend to use a lot of this for osseointegration, you see that the skin is healed very nicely around the stem that supports basically, it's the other half of his upper arm bone. But skin doesn't heal well around things that come out. In my laboratory work, we have an animal preparation in which there is a permanent implant on the head, and that means that you have cut scalp and implanted this, and then try to heal it up. The edges don't really heal. The skin doesn't close over, and frankly, you don't want it to, because that's a great way to trap infection. And so, if I had to say one thing that prosthetics doesn't do well, a challenge that science hasn't resolved, it's how to get things through the skin.
We can get things through the skin real easy. We can demonstrate.
Oh yeah, well we could do that, sure.
Please, no violence on the panel.
It's not violence when it's a scientific demonstration.
Please, no scientific demonstrations on the panel. This is theoretical,
wait a minute.
not practical. All right, well, I think I saw several people have questions, so if there's someone who can run a mic around.
I'm going to start over here and kind of work my way down. Testing. All right, good. Come over here. All right, go ahead.
Hi, yes. So I was wondering if the definition of prosthetic required that it replaced a missing limb or something. I follow a YouTuber who has SMA, and he has a Jaco arm.
Sorry, say that again. To replace a what?
Like a direct body part, I guess. So I follow a YouTuber who has SMA, and he has an arm attached to his wheelchair that gives him function. Would that count as a prosthetic, or is that something different by definition?
So that'd be an assistive device,
Yeah.
just like the wheelchair is. That does fall under FDA, but it's probably going to be without getting technical, a class 1 device means very low risk, and usually it's pretty much just rubber stamped through. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. We have one over here?
Hey there. I have a couple questions. So are there any countries that are doing medical tourism? So, some of the things that...
Yes.
And is there a country that is knocking it out of the park, that they might have different regulation? And
So when osseointegration first started getting big, I believe you could go to Australia or Germany and get an OI. And then actually the first patient I ever saw in my clinic with a leg attached with an OI abutment had her leg made in Australia. It gets a little tricky for what we do here in the States because My scope of practice does not go beyond the top of her prosthetic knee. So I can take her knee off of her leg and expose the abutment, but I can't touch anything above that on her because that surgery was done somewhere else, and the scope of my profession does not extend to that part of her leg. So I can fix things on her prosthesis, but if something goes sideways with her osseointegration abutment, I can't help her at all. And there are screws and so forth on that, and those are all on her.
By the way, there's a story. The gentleman that used to come down here to Science Track by the name of John Smar, head of infectious diseases at Sinai, Baltimore. And he told a story about how he had a patient come in one time whose brother said, "Oh, you don't need to pay for all that." And he put 3-inch wood screws through the bone and attached a wooden leg to him. And then John had to treat the resulting infection. So yeah, it's that's medical tourism at its worst.
Please do not seek medical care at Home Depot.
Or from anybody named Bubba.
It is going to get a lot. Well, it's already gotten a lot harder in Europe because previously they had what was called the Medical Device Directive, which was basically here's what you should do and be good. And there was the medical community was a self-policing system. A couple of bad actors, a couple of really bad high-profile implant problems, and now they're converting to the medical device regulations, which is a much more U.S.-oriented, U.S.-mimicking system where it's all top-down. And so innovation in Europe has come to a screeching halt. And you're not going to be seeing medical tourism to at least the parts of Europe that are in the EU and fall under the MDRs.
It seems like the two biggest.
Get real friendly with that mic. Get right up on your mask.
It seems like the two biggest barriers to advancing our innovations of prosthesis is money. And I forgot what the other one is because it's really early, but. I was wondering if the outcomes for patients are better in countries with socialized medicine. Do they get better options and better outcomes?
Oh boy.
I have a colleague who used to work in the UK. The system there is very different than here. So here you have private companies who provide prosthetics for profit. In the UK, where they have obviously the NHS, the prosthetic manufacturers actually bid for contracts for the year, or I think it's 2 years. And then whichever company wins the contract then runs the clinics for those 2 years. And then they have a set amount of money to spend during that year treating patients. So I think the correct answer is, unfortunately, yes and no. Yes and no in that me personally, in my practice, I would love to take the profit motive out of what I do. Not that I don't want to make money, but I don't want to be in a situation where I have to think about like how much money is my company making on this when I'm making decisions for my patients. So in that sense, I believe it's better. But the other side of that is that they have a limited pool of money with which to treat everybody in a year because of the way the system is set up. And so I know I've heard several stories of patients who are assigned to one particular care center because of where they live, and they simply can't get the leg that they need. So they do fit sea legs in the UK, but sea legs are very expensive. So if your particular care center is out of money the year that you need a sea leg, you're not getting a sea leg. And so I've heard stories of patients who end up having to get their care transferred to another center that might have more funds remaining for that year. So unfortunately, it's kind of a mixed bag. I wish it was kind of more clear cut, but it's not.
As both the dual American Canadian citizen, having experienced both systems, I'll echo a lot of that. There are advantages and disadvantages to both systems. Hard to say.
Okay, so I actually have two questions that are kind of unrelated. I think the first one I was going to ask is, has there been any research done in terms of placing a magnet in that residual limb and attaching the prosthetic via magnet?
I haven't seen anything along those lines.
The only one that I'm aware of is with an osseointegration where you have a stem coming out. Johnny Matheny's limb has a magnetic bearing that allows the detachment, but that's the only one that I'm aware of that's done that. Nothing through the skin. And one of the reasons actually is because you would want to use a neodymium magnet.
Mm-hmm.
And the neodymium magnets are so strong that they crush the tissue between the two parts. So it's not really something that you would want to use for attachments.
Okay, I was just thinking in terms of not just decreasing the compromisation of skin integrity between the prosthetic and the limb.
Unfortunately, it would compromise it more.
Okay.
There is
that would make sense.
There is one instance that I know of where they use magnets, and that's in facial anaplastology. Okay. So if you're missing a nose or an ear, I've seen them put magnets, but that's mounted onto the bone, onto the remnant bone, and then it's carrying something that's very, very light.
Yeah, I know someone who has a cosmetic eye prosthetic. When he doesn't care to wear it, you can see the two attachments.
Yeah. There is in limb distraction procedures. So when a patient, for whatever reason, has their two legs are different lengths, they were born that way, they had an injury, whatever. There's actually a newer system. It used to be that you would apply pins through the skin and you basically traction that gap and you sever the bone in between the pins and distract it a little bit over like a year.
You see Gattaca? Did you see Gattaca? Yeah. The movie? Yeah, in the beginning of Gattaca, he's too short. And so they put that thing on.
That's
him.
right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So there's a newer system that actually utilizes magnetic implants. So instead of having the pins, remember I said stuff going across the skin bad. So instead they've got magnets on the implant and they just magnetically distract the patient's bone over time.
This all sounds like it hurts a lot.
Oh,
doesn't sound comfortable at all.
If you were as a child, if you had growing pains,
yeah,
right, that's basically
what it is.
No, it's that on steroids.
My second question kind of piggybacks off what she asked, but I know amputations in the United States, it tends to be more of the lower income population, at least from what I've worked a little bit in this field, and just from what I've seen, it tends to be that. Mainly because of complications secondary to like diabetes or hypertension or that array of stuff. And and a big issue we've had is like being able to fund or to have the patient, the reimbursement source be able to fund the limb. And so what lobbying effects is being done to get Medicare and Medicaid and private insurance to get these patients what they need in order to function in society better?
So I can't speak for every state. I can only speak for California where I practice. I've actually never had a problem getting any patient with Medicaid or Medicare a prosthesis. It might not be the one they want, but I can get them something. And in a lot of cases, what's happened, or the reason I can't go in the direction the patient might want to go is simply because, and this goes back to my comment about the profit motive, is that Medicaid might pay my company rather, like $8,000 for this patient's prosthesis, but it's going to cost me $8,000 worth of components to put it together. And then you still have to add in time and effort and fabrication and all that. And so it doesn't work out. My company's not going to allow me to do that. So we have to be mindful about what kinds of things we're putting on those patients. So typically and that's not to say that we're putting patients on like dime store legs. These are all very, very functional legs. I don't think in the United States of America today anybody is getting a leg that's like made out of cardboard tubes, just to exaggerate it. Everybody is getting something that's very, very good. It's going to allow you to walk. It's going to allow you to function. Will it allow you to run a marathon? No. But most insurances wouldn't pay for that anyway.
I think it's important too to think about, make sure we're not falling into an ableist trap. Is it that we need to get a better prosthesis for this individual, or we need to think about how the environment is built to interact with them, and maybe we can make their lives better by putting better doorknobs on, and then guess what? We all benefit because the doorknobs are easier to operate. And sidewalk cuts are one of my favorite examples, right? The little ramps at the intersection. Those were first installed to help wheelchair users actually I think it was in Berkeley. And now they're awesome, right? I got a suitcase and I can roll down the sidewalk cut. I benefit from it and I can walk.
Yeah, the truth of the matter is that they were a great benefit to my father, whose vision, when he stepped out into the sun, he lost most of his detail vision. It took him much longer to adapt than most people. So if he had a sidewalk cut, frankly, half the time when my knees are bothering me, I want the sidewalk cut. One of the advantages of the Western systems where we do have private insurance and the companies operate for profit, they have a motive for lobbying because they want to be able to sell their product. They want patients to be able to wear their product. And so they have a motive to lobby for the reimbursement. And so that's one of the efforts. So what you'll find is that the lobbying efforts are industry efforts. You have patient advocacy groups, yes, but you also have the industry that makes the devices, that is lobbying for greater penetration into the market as well.
A question that I have goes back to a comment made earlier about the, the upper arm, extensions for doing the nerve control or nerve-controlled prosthesis. What's the technology going on to working further back up into the shoulder for nerve detection? Is that something that's not really possible, or is it just we haven't figured out how to do it right yet?
Well, we can pick up nerve impulses and muscle impulses from just about anywhere. The question is how easily can it be discriminated from any other impulse? What was done with the transcutaneous nerve migration is to identify the nerves that are controlling all of these muscles down here and say, okay, those are distinct nerves. We're now going to place them in distinct locations around the arm. When you start getting into the shoulder, you have fewer distinct nerve bundles to deal with. And frankly, all of the individual nerves that are operating the lower limb are now all bundled as you start getting into the shoulder and back up to the spinal cord. And they're much harder to separate out. But as far as getting shoulder controls, you can generally do that with electromyography, just recording the muscle twitches. And in fact, muscle twitches are how claws were operated, is with a muscle twitch and not with pulling the nerve impulses.
So a follow-up question to that to some extent. Clearly our brain is the best computer we have to control the limb itself. I haven't heard much talk about maybe the idea of putting some of that control back into the prosthesis. So the idea of almost an AI system within the prosthetic limb itself would reduce the need to get that very complex integration between the nerve endings and the limb itself.
Strangely enough, it is not the brain that does most of the work of coordinating muscle movements. The spinal cord does that. And the spinal reflexes, which are always counterbalancing an extension with a flexion, those reflexes are handling most of the coordination. And frankly, if the brain was left up to this, if I were to reach out to grab this, I'd be doing this. And then I have to totally reprogram when he pulls the glass away. It is with the spinal reflex that I'm able to make a smooth motion that stops where it needs to stop. So in reality, if we were going to put in an AI system of some sort, what we really want is we want to mimic the spinal reflex. There has been some study that's being a little bit simplistic. We also have the cerebellum, which does a lot of this coordination, and it has a lot to do with the damping out of these signals. So the work that was done at Pitt with the implants on the motor cortex were, in a way, they were amazing because the person's own brain figured out how to operate the different joints of the robotic arm. It wasn't the case that they found the cell for flexing the finger. It was the case that they said, try to flex your finger. There was a cell that fired, and okay, yeah, but we didn't have that one wired up to the finger. And they go, okay, let me try another. Let me try something else. And then eventually, the scientists allowed the brain to tell them what to hook up to the robotic, as opposed to simply trying to say, okay, this is the finger area. It didn't really work that way. It didn't work that well. So in a sense, our brain is our best controller, and if we're going to go to the extent of putting the implant directly onto the brain or directly into the brain, it's more likely that it's going to be fairly crude, and we're going to go, very spastic until we figure out, oh, wait a minute, that does that. And then our brains actually do the remapping for us.
I'd also add that this company Autobach, they make parts for just about every level of amputation, and I think they're actually one of the most progressive manufacturers when it comes to trying to be thoughtful about how they program their devices and programming them so that the use of them is intuitive. But they do have one option on one of their hands that almost nobody uses. And the idea is that if you're going to go pick something up, right, with your natural hand, it's actually a lot of movements altogether. In your hand, it's an open and a close, right? You reach out for this thing, and you don't reach out for it like this. You reach out like this, and you open it at the last second, and then you close on it, and you pick it up. And so they actually program that into one of their hands, where if you gave it a close signal, like I want to pick this up, they said, we'll mimic that. We'll let you do that. So the hand will go out here, and then you give it a close signal, and it's going to open briefly and then allow you to close on this thing. Everyone hated it because all these patients had been taught, when I fire this muscle, it closes the hand. And then the first thing they see is the hand open. And so there's this disconnect between, I'm telling it to do this, but it's doing this. And it became this disjointed control. So if you could give this to somebody who had never used a prosthesis before, you could get them to use it. But trying to lay these kinds of learning systems over top of somebody who's already learned something a certain way, it's really difficult.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me very briefly to follow on that. When they first started working with this, they were not necessarily allowing the patients to see the limb while they were trying to do all the mapping, and they found out it was taking so long to map. Once the patient could see the result of whatever they were commanding, learning went like that. I know he's got one over there.
Two major schools of thought right now are mechanical limb and organ replacement and more organic tissue replacement. As material science continues to produce more bio-inspired materials, how will the design philosophy change? And further, as prosthetics that integrate living cells or biomaterials become more advanced, how will the medical aspect of the prosthetics change? Will patients have the right to choose what sort of replacement they want, or will we see a more centralized approach?
There's a lot in there.
That's a lot to unpack. Tissue engineering is a fascinating field, and Wake Forest has one of the leading tissue engineering institutes with Anthony Atala. Anthony created the first artificial bladder by dripping a culture of stem cells over a balloon. And then once he had it built up to the point where it could sustain itself, deflate the balloon and implant that in a patient. He's currently working on 3D printing kidneys and livers. And the biggest problem they're running into, though, is the fact that the blood vessel components are not coherent. The blood vessels, you can 3D print the appropriate types of cells and stem cells, but that doesn't mean that you get a functioning blood vessel out of it. You don't get a functioning glomerulus if it's the kidney, or hepatocyte if it's the liver. And those have to have ducts, they have to have blood flow, they have to have specialized cells, and they have to have all the endocrine functions. For a period of about 3 years, one of the neuroengineers swore he had stem cell cultures differentiating into neurons. And the defining characteristic of a neuron is electrical potential. And he could get these cultures to secrete the appropriate neurotransmitters, but we could never get an action potential. We can never get electrical potential out of them. So there's a lot of challenges to it. It frankly will, if we get to the point where we can clone an organ, then transplant becomes the option instead of prosthetic replacement. And it puts all of us out of business.
So we had a panel on Friday on regenerative medicine. So whoever builds a time machine, you can go back and listen to it. But my PhD was in tissue engineering specifically, and my advisor always said, when I was in school, he always said that, well, we'll have tissue engineered vasculature in probably about 20 years. He said that for about 20 years.
Yeah.
So we still don't have it.
Yeah. We say that about prosthetics all the time. Memory prosthetics and the like.
As technology gets more incorporated into these prosthetics, is there any movement towards getting things networked for software updates or system monitoring or anything like that?
There are efforts, basically to hack the systems, because generally, at least in my understanding, most of the manufacturers retain, it's not an open source platform, but when you've got things like the Augment implant that the company goes bye-bye, then you get some interesting hacker communities. Now, how do you make sure that this back-ended firmware mod is safe and effective and not going to do something horrible? That's a real tough question.
And as you start getting to that point, then you're going to find a different problem arise. A person with prosthetic may be denied security clearances because the cyber intel community is terrified of implants right now. It's not they're terrified of the implants. They're terrified of the prospect that they could be used to deposit malware. If you have networking, in fact, the movement right now is to lock out all networking functions in implants, because I'm working with a company right now working on a memory prosthetic, and the question is, are you going to use a Wi-Fi or a Bluetooth type signal so that you don't have to wire it? And the answer is no, we are not. The closest we're going to get is inductive loop, which is, the same way you charge your phone, wireless charging your phone. It's how the cochlear implant works. It's how the Argus 2 worked, is that the percutaneous communication was via two matched antennae.
Can you imagine a keylogger embedded into two prosthetic hands? Yikes.
Unfortunately, I can.
Yeah.
That is why I write science fiction.
Ken, you said you had a list of things that you would like for myoelectric prosthetics. I would love to see the ability to splay my real hand and my myoelectric hand to actually, you were doing it during the, yes, exactly. That's what I've been looking for since I got it about 5 years ago.
To be able to like move your fingers like this.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah.
You can do the Dr. Evil.
Yeah.
Doing it, I would just love to be able to sit like this, like everybody else, and listen to the conversation and
The gentleman in the row in front of you has the only myoelectric hand that can splay the fingers, but they splay passively. Yeah, they don't. It's not like this. But Johnny Matheny's fingers do splay.
Yes.
They when they open up, they go from this to this.
His is
Yeah.
a one of a kind.
Yeah,
It really
right.
is a one of a kind proof
But-
of concept.
All right. Duly noted.
I think we have time for about one more question.
You mentioned that going through the skin is difficult. Well, how do they do it with, for example, a colostomy patient?
With great care.
It's all the same. It's all the same problems.
It is.
Yeah, it's all the same problems. You have a hole, and there, even if it's not bleeding, there's still serous fluid in your system that leaks out through that hole. So, like any patient with an otomy of any kind, they're constantly keeping that area clean, wiping up the drainage. It's a daily battle for those types of patients. Yeah.
It's one of those things where they can make the advantage is that you've got an inside tube connecting with an outside tube. Your skin is a tube encasing you, just like sausage encasing, and you invert
We are all
that,
sausages.
You've now got the intestine. Okay, so you've got essentially epidermis connecting to an endodermis. So, but when you're actually trying to go through the skin, then you've got dermis and viscera trying to connect out through the skin, and they're both problems. Actually, I've had an ostomy. I know exactly what that problem is, and it's a mess.
Bacteria and fungi go, lunchtime!
Yeah.
You-
2 minutes left, so if someone has something real quick.
Okay.
The plague doctor.
You'll have to excuse me if I get something wrong here. I'm mostly just a. Is this coming through? Yeah. All right. Sorry. I'm mostly just an enthusiast on these kinds of matters. But from various articles that I've read, I've heard that they use a type of metal often in bone grafting. I believe it's titanium gold alloy, which is used for the large part because it has a antibacterial properties, and it also has a low rejection rate by the body. Wouldn't that same type of metal be used in the type of procedure that you're suggesting, where it would put an implant that has a hook on it on the end of the limb, and reduce infection rate?
Yeah, so there are the primary metals used in endoprostheses would be either titanium, Ti6Al4V, cobalt chrome. Those are about your principal ones. The big one that got a lot of interest in the industry for a while was tantalum. Tantalum is an element that can be formed into this really cool kind of foamy structure that looks an awful lot like the porous bone that we have at the end of our long bones. And yeah, I worked for the company. I actually worked on that project. So we had a theory that tantalum was antimicrobial. We could never get the data to work. But yeah, the idea was that we could create a percutaneous abutment, so a piece of metal that would stick across the skin, and we would skin it, coat it with the tantalum, the porous tantalum structure. The skin would be able to grow right up into it. Skin does generally grow nicely up to tantalum and try to form a better barrier, a better seal on there. We could basically never get it really to work as well as it should.
And with that, we are at time. Thank you all for coming. If you guys want to talk, if there's anything you want to promote, or where they can find you next?
So I'm actually next. I'm heading over to Apocalypse Rising. But tomorrow morning at 10, we're doing a little more talk with the androids and cyborgs, et cetera, over in the military sci-fi track. A little bit more on that.
Tomorrow at 10, I will also actually be here for the economics of R&D, talking about how the money gets found. But much more entertaining, God help me, is tonight I will be on Science versus Movies.
Oh boy.
So please come and watch us squirm as we try to legitimately or explain or backsplain the science in horrible movies.
Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Oh, God help us. It's a lot of fun.
I'm actually not on any more panels here. I'll just be trying to enjoy the rest of DragonCon with the rest of you. But if you'd like to check out my book, I've got links up here on these cards for my book that just came out last week.
Yay.
Thank you all for coming.